Chapter 1. The day I realized the dream was quiet. The evening looked exactly like every other evening. The same light settled through the window at the same angle. The same sounds drifted in from the street below. Cars passing, a distant voice, the soft rhythm of a life continuing without urgency. I moved through my routine without resistance, without thought. Dinner, dishes, a glance at my phone. Nothing felt wrong. That was the strange part. I sat down on the couch and let the quiet fill the room. The television stayed off. I wasn't tired, but I wasn't energized either. I felt neutral, suspended somewhere between effort and rest. I realized then that I hadn't felt desire all day. Not frustration, not sadness, desire. There was no longing for something else, no pull toward a future version of myself, just the steady hum of routine, operating smoothly enough to avoid notice. That absence unsettled me. I tried to remember the last time I had wanted something deeply, wanted it without immediately negotiating it down to something safer. The memory didn't come easily. It felt distant, like recalling a sound you once knew well, but couldn't quite reproduce. I looked around the room, searching for clues. Everything was in its place, clean, functional, predictable. The environment reflected a life built to maintain, not to expand. The realization crept in slowly. My dream hadn't disappeared. It had gone quiet. That thought landed softly, but it stayed. I had expected that if I ever lost my dream, it would happen loudly, through failure, through disappointment, through some defining moment that would justify the loss. That hadn't happened. Instead, the dream had stopped speaking. I noticed how long it had been since I thought about it without immediately changing the subject in my mind. How often I redirected my attention to practical concerns, convincing myself that realism was maturity. The dream hadn't demanded attention in a long time, and I hadn't checked on it. I stood up and walked through the apartment, turning lights on and off, as if the movement might shake something loose inside me. It didn't. The quiet followed me. There was no pain attached to the realization, no surge of regret, just an unease that settled beneath the surface, calm but insistent. I understood then that the absence of desire wasn't peace, it was distance. I had created a life where nothing pressed too hard, nothing asked too much, nothing disrupted the balance I had carefully built. That balance came at a cost. I sat back down and rested my hands on my knees, grounding myself in the moment. My breathing was steady. My thoughts were clear. Too clear. I thought about how often I had told myself I would return to the dream later, when things were easier, when life slowed down, when I felt more secure. Later had arrived, and I had brought nothing back with me. The dream didn't protest. It didn't argue. It didn't fade dramatically into disappointment. It simply stopped knocking. That was the quiet shock. Not the loss of the dream, but the loss of its voice. I felt a subtle ache form in my chest, not sharp enough to hurt, but heavy enough to notice. The ache wasn't grief. It was recognition. I had mistaken silence for resolution. I had assumed that because the longing wasn't loud anymore, it had been resolved, that wanting less meant growing up. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. I had grown accustomed to ignoring it. I remembered the early days, when the dream had felt alive, when it interrupted my thoughts and colored my decisions, when it made the future feel open instead of planned. That version of me hadn't been reckless, just awake. I realized how long it had been since I felt that way. The dream hadn't died. It stopped asking for my attention. The sentence repeated itself steady and undeniable. I thought about how many times I had chosen convenience over curiosity, how often I dismissed small impulses because they didn't fit into the structure I had built. Each choice felt harmless on its own. Together, they created silence. I wasn't angry at myself. Anger would have implied conflict. This felt quieter than that, more internal, more personal. I had neglected something essential without noticing the neglect itself. The room felt heavier as the awareness settled, not oppressive, but weighted with meaning. I understood then that fading dreams don't announce themselves as failures. They don't collapse or shatter. They withdraw. They wait. And if you don't turn to them, they learn to be quiet. That knowledge didn't push me into action. It didn't inspire me. It didn't demand anything. It simply stayed. The unease wasn't asking me to fix anything. It was asking me to notice. I sat there until the light outside dimmed completely, until the room was lit only by the glow of the street. I didn't reach for distractions. I let the stillness hold. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel the absence fully, not as failure, as loss through neglect. The night deepened, calm and unchanged. The world continued exactly as it had before, but inside, something had shifted. I hadn't lost my dream in a moment of collapse. I had watched it grow quiet over time. And now that I had finally heard the silence for what it was, I knew something important. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the first time I truly understood what had been slipping away slowly, politely, without ever demanding to be mourned. Chapter 2. When wanting became too tiring. Life kept working. That was the problem. Each morning arrived with the same quiet efficiency. I woke up on time. I completed what needed to be done. I responded when spoken to. I paid attention where attention was required. Nothing collapsed. Nothing demanded rescue. From the outside, everything looked stable. Inside, something had gone dull. I moved through my days like someone maintaining a machine, checking systems, adjusting routines, keeping everything operational. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't satisfied either. I existed in a narrow space between effort and feeling, where emotions were managed rather than experienced. Wanting something more felt unnecessary, excessive, almost irresponsible. I told myself that desire was a luxury, something for people with fewer obligations, something to revisit once life became lighter, once energy returned, once certainty appeared. But certainty never arrived, only repetition. I noticed how often I chose comfort without acknowledging the choice. I stayed with what was familiar because it required less explanation, less justification, less risk. Comfort didn't ask questions. Longing did. Wanting something deeply meant admitting that what I had wasn't enough. That admission felt dangerous. It threatened the careful balance I had built, a balance constructed from practicality, compromise, and quiet endurance. So I stopped listening, not abruptly, gradually. I adjusted my expectations downward, telling myself it was wisdom. I replaced curiosity with responsibility. I reframed avoidance as patience. The language sounded reasonable. The cost remained invisible. I still remembered the feeling of wanting something badly enough that it altered how the world looked, how colors sharpened, how time felt elastic, how effort carried meaning rather than obligation. That feeling felt distant now, not gone, just heavy. I had learned to associate wanting with disappointment, with exhaustion, with the draining cycle of hope followed by restraint. Over time, my mind began to treat desire as something that demanded too much in return. It became easier not to want. I noticed how often I dismissed impulses before they fully formed, how quickly I talked myself out of interest, how automatically I chose the option that asked the least from me emotionally. It wasn't fear, it was fatigue. The fatigue of imagining effort, of anticipating struggle, of preparing for outcomes that might not justify the energy required. I told myself I was conserving strength. What I was really doing was avoiding disappointment. There were moments when the dream tried to surface, small moments, a thought during a commute, a memory triggered by a conversation, a feeling stirred by something I read or heard. Each time I redirected, not because I didn't care, but because caring felt expensive. I had learned that hope comes with a cost, and I wasn't sure I could afford it anymore. People around me described my life as steady. They used words like grounded, sensible, mature. I nodded. I accepted the labels because they sounded like approval. They confirmed that I was doing what was expected, that I had chosen stability over uncertainty. What they didn't see was the quiet numbness beneath that stability, the way days blended together without texture, the way accomplishments felt neutral rather than fulfilling. I had mistaken calm for peace. In reality, I was managing myself into emotional silence. There was no moment when I decided to stop dreaming, no declaration, no surrender. I simply grew tired of carrying the weight of wanting. I didn't stop dreaming because I failed. I stopped because hoping felt heavy. That sentence didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, through countless small decisions that leaned toward ease rather than meaning. I had built a life that asked little from me emotionally. In return, I asked little from myself. It was sustainable, but it was hollow. I remember sitting one afternoon, staring at nothing in particular, realizing how long it had been since I felt excited about the future. Not anxious, not worried, excited. The absence felt normal. That realization frightened me more than disappointment ever had. Disappointment passes. Fatigue settles. I had grown accustomed to a version of myself that didn't expect much, a version that measured success by how little disruption it caused. That version functioned well, but it didn't dream. The dream had learned to retreat. It no longer interrupted my thoughts or challenged my routines. It waited quietly, as if respecting the boundaries I had drawn. I had taught it to stay quiet. I thought about how many times I had chosen rest over risk, ease over engagement, how often I had told myself I would revisit the dream when I had more energy. Energy never came, because energy isn't found in comfort. It's created through desire. Without wanting, everything became maintenance, and maintenance, no matter how efficient, never feels alive. I wasn't defeated. I was tired. Tired of imagining effort. Tired of hoping something might change. Tired of carrying desire without knowing where to place it. So I set it down, carefully, politely. I told myself it was temporary. I didn't notice when temporary became permanent. The exhaustion wasn't physical, it was emotional. The kind that comes from holding yourself in check for too long, from constantly choosing what feels manageable over what feels meaningful. I had learned to live without friction, and in doing so, I had removed the spark. Nothing dramatic marked the change, no collapse, no crisis, just a gradual quieting of something that once mattered. The dream didn't fade because it wasn't strong enough. It faded because I was tired of listening. And as I sat with that truth, I understood something important. This wasn't about lost potential. It was about sustained avoidance. The exhaustion wasn't proof that the dream was unrealistic. It was proof that I had been carrying it alone, without permission, without space, without honesty. Wanting had become too tiring because I hadn't allowed myself to want openly. I had hidden the dream behind practicality, and eventually it stopped asking to be seen. The realization didn't come with resolution, only clarity. I hadn't been protecting myself. I had been shrinking quietly. And now that I could finally name the exhaustion for what it was, I knew this story wasn't about defeat. It was about how dreams fade not through failure, but through fatigue that goes unspoken for too long. Chapter 3. The Version of Me Who Believed. I wasn't looking for it. That was the strange part. I had opened the drawer for something practical. Documents, receipts, anything that belonged to the present. Instead, my hand brushed against a thin notebook tucked beneath old papers, its cover bent, its edges softened by time. I paused. I already knew what it was. I hadn't touched it in years. When I lifted it out, a faint feeling moved through my chest. Not excitement, not nostalgia, something quieter, heavier, like recognition without warmth. I sat down and opened it carefully, as if the pages might crumble under the weight of being remembered. Inside was my handwriting, messy, urgent, alive. Sentences ran into each other, ideas spilled without permission. There was no caution in the words, no apology for wanting more. I didn't remember being that person, but I recognized them instantly. This was the version of me who believed. Not in guarantees, not in success, in possibility. I turned the pages slowly. Each one carried traces of a self that hadn't yet learned to negotiate every desire into something smaller. A self that wrote without asking whether it was reasonable. A self that assumed wanting was allowed. I felt my throat tighten. Not because the dreams were unrealistic, because they were honest. I remembered how it felt to live with that kind of belief, how the future once felt open instead of conditional, how effort felt like movement rather than obligation. That memory didn't inspire me. It embarrassed me. Shame arrived quietly, settling over the moment like dust. I felt exposed, as if I were reading someone else's private thoughts, someone naive enough to trust their own wanting. I closed the notebook halfway, instinctively. It was easier not to look. Belief is dangerous when you no longer recognize yourself in it. I sat there for a long time, holding the notebook without opening it again. My mind searched for explanations, reasons, justifications. Life happened, responsibilities grew, reality intervened. All of that was true, and still incomplete. Because as I looked at those pages, one truth became unavoidable. The dream hadn't faded first. Belief had. I remembered the moment I started doubting whether I was allowed to want what I wanted. It wasn't dramatic. No one told me I couldn't. No door was slammed shut. The doubt grew quietly, shaped by comparison, by practicality, by subtle messages absorbed over time. Be realistic. Be grateful. Be careful. I listened. Slowly, belief became something I treated with suspicion. Wanting felt indulgent, unnecessary, selfish. So I moderated it, then minimized it, then stopped acknowledging it altogether. The notebook rested in my hands like evidence. This version of me, the one who believed, hadn't failed. They had been silenced. I felt a familiar instinct rise, to judge that earlier self, to call them idealistic, to label their confidence as ignorance. That judgment softened when I noticed something else. There was courage in those pages. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that assumes effort is worthwhile even without guarantees, the kind that doesn't ask for permission before wanting. I realized how long it had been since I felt that way. The shame deepened, not because the dream felt impossible, because I had distanced myself from the part of me that believed it was allowed. I didn't lose my dream. I lost my belief that I was allowed to want it. The sentence formed slowly, but once it did, it stayed. I closed the notebook fully and rested it on the table beside me. I didn't feel the urge to throw it away or to return it to the drawer. I just sat there, letting the awareness settle. Regret didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers, soft, persistent, not accusing, observant. I thought about how many times I had dismissed longing as impractical, how often I talked myself out of interest before it became desire, how quickly I had replaced curiosity with caution. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they told a different story. The belief hadn't faded because it was proven wrong, but because it was never defended. I hadn't argued for it. I hadn't protected it. I had quietly agreed to outgrow it. The room felt still as the realization took shape, not tense, just attentive, as if something inside me had finally leaned forward to listen. I didn't feel the urge to act. There was no sudden motivation, no resolution, only awareness. I had mistaken restraint for maturity. What I had actually practiced was disconnection. The dream hadn't needed certainty to survive. It needed belief. And belief had been the first thing I surrendered. I thought about how many years had passed since I last asked myself what I wanted without immediately qualifying the answer. How long it had been since I let a desire exist without measuring its feasibility. I had trained myself to be realistic. In doing so, I had become distant. The regret didn't feel sharp. It felt quiet and heavy, like something long ignored, finally acknowledged. I picked up the notebook again and flipped to a random page. There was a sentence underlined 2 times. I don't know how this will work. I just know I need to try. I stared at it for a long time. That version of me hadn't been fearless, just willing. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back in the drawer, but this time I didn't hide it. I set it on top, visible, present. The awareness lingered. I wasn't ready to reclaim the dream, but I could no longer pretend I didn't know where it had gone. This wasn't about failure. It was about permission. Somewhere along the way, I had decided that wanting required justification, that belief needed approval, that dreams had to earn their place in adulthood. They don't. They only need to be acknowledged. As I stood up and moved back into the rhythm of the evening, the room felt unchanged, but inside, a quiet crack had formed. Not enough to break anything, enough to let awareness in. I hadn't lost my dream. I had lost my belief. And now that I could finally see that distinction clearly, I knew something had shifted, not toward action, toward honesty. And that was enough for now.
Chapter 4. Choosing Safety Over Becoming. I didn't choose safety once. I chose it again and again. Each choice felt reasonable on its own, sensible, mature. The kind of decision people nod at approvingly when you explain it out loud. Stability mattered. Predictability mattered. Responsibility mattered. So I leaned toward them. Every time. When options appeared that carried uncertainty, I weighed them carefully and then set them down. Not because they were impossible, but because they asked too much from parts of me I had learned to keep quiet. Risk began to look childish, like something you grow out of once you understand how fragile life can be. I told myself that becoming someone else could wait, that I was already someone solid, someone dependable, someone finished. That idea brought comfort. It also brought something else I didn't name at the time. Distance. I noticed how my life slowly organized itself around predictability. Days followed familiar patterns. Decisions followed established logic. I optimized for minimal disruption. From the outside, it looked like growth. From the inside, it felt like containment. I didn't feel unhappy. That was the most confusing part. I felt grateful. Grateful for what worked. Grateful for what remained steady. Gratitude, however, has a shadow when it's used to silence longing. I felt it when conversations drifted toward dreams, when someone mentioned starting something new, changing direction, taking a chance. I listened politely, I smiled, I offered encouragement, and somewhere beneath that support, something tightened. Not envy, bitterness. Quiet, controlled, unexpressed bitterness. I watched others move forward without spectacle. They didn't announce it. They didn't demand validation. They just kept choosing becoming over comfort. I told myself they were braver than me, then smarter, then luckier. Each explanation allowed me to remain still. Risk, I decided, was for people who hadn't learned their limits yet. I had, or so I believed. In truth, I had learned my fears well enough to build a life around avoiding them. Each safe choice felt like a deposit into stability. Each unchosen risk felt like a withdrawal from becoming. The account didn't go negative overnight. It accumulated quietly. I felt it in small moments of hesitation where curiosity once lived, caution where excitement used to rise. I felt it when opportunities came wrapped in uncertainty, and I dismissed them quickly, almost reflexively. Not now. Not necessary. Not worth it. The language sounded responsible. The effect was cumulative. I began to sense an internal split forming. One part of me felt grounded, settled, grateful. The other felt constrained, unheard, slowly receding. The tension between those parts grew subtle but persistent. I didn't resent my life. I resented the version of myself that had agreed to stop expanding it. That resentment stayed buried beneath gratitude, making it harder to detect and easier to deny. I would remind myself of what I had, the security, the absence of crisis, the predictability of outcomes. All of it was true, and still incomplete. Stability, I learned, can coexist with self-betrayal, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when you repeatedly choose who you already are over who you might become. I noticed how often I avoided situations that required vulnerability under the guise of practicality, how often I framed courage as recklessness, how easily I labeled ambition as impatience. These beliefs didn't arrive accidentally. They protected me, but they also limited me. Each time I chose safety, I felt a brief sense of relief, the relief of staying known, of not having to renegotiate my identity, of not risking visible failure. That relief faded quickly. What replaced it was neutrality, and neutrality sustained long enough begins to feel like absence. I didn't feel trapped. I felt contained by decisions I had made willingly. That was the most difficult part to face. No one had forced me into this version of life. I had selected it carefully, repeatedly. I thought about how often I had framed growth as something that should feel right before it happens, how I waited for clarity before allowing movement, how I confused discomfort with danger. In doing so, I preserved stability at the cost of expansion. The emotional debt accumulated quietly, not as sadness, as dullness, as a slow erosion of energy, as a sense that I was maintaining a life rather than inhabiting it. I would feel it most when I imagined the future not as fear, but as repetition, the same patterns extending forward unchanged. That image didn't frighten me, it disappointed me. Disappointment is harder to justify than fear. Fear feels urgent, disappointment feels personal. I had become skilled at explaining my choices in ways that sounded wise. I had learned to frame restraint as maturity, patience as depth, caution as intelligence. Those explanations worked externally. Internally, something remained unresolved. I was grateful, and I was bitter. I was stable, and I was betraying a quieter part of myself. That contradiction lived inside me without resolution. It didn't explode, it simmered. I realized how often I had said, "This is fine," not as a statement of contentment, but as a boundary against wanting more. Fine became the ceiling. Anything beyond it felt unnecessary, indulgent. I had learned to distrust intensity, to see it as something that fades, disappoints, complicates. Safety felt sustainable. Becoming felt risky. So I kept choosing safety, not once, but over time. And time, when filled with repeated avoidance, begins to shape identity. I wasn't becoming less capable. I was becoming less open. The realization didn't arrive as a verdict. It arrived as recognition. I had prioritized staying intact over becoming alive. That choice hadn't ruined my life. It had narrowed it. And narrowing happens quietly, without resistance, until one day you notice how little space remains for desire to move. The emotional debt didn't demand immediate payment. It accrued interest. Interest paid in muted days, in restrained conversations, in a future that felt secure but uninspired. I hadn't chosen the wrong life. I had chosen a smaller one. That understanding didn't fill me with regret. It filled me with tension, the tension of knowing that safety had protected me and also kept me from becoming. The question lingered, unresolved. How much safety is enough before it becomes self-betrayal? I didn't have an answer yet, only the awareness that the cost of predictability wasn't obvious. It was cumulative, and it was still being paid.
Chapter 5. The Night I Admitted the Truth. The night didn't arrive with warning. It settled in quietly the way it always did, as if nothing important was about to happen. The room dimmed, the outside noise softened, the world slowed into a familiar stillness that usually brought relief. That night, it didn't. I was alone, not dramatically, not painfully, just alone in the ordinary sense. The lights were low, the air was calm, nothing demanded my attention. And because nothing demanded it, everything surfaced. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely in my lap, staring at the floor without really seeing it. My body felt heavy, not from exhaustion, but from something harder to name, a pressure that had been building quietly for years, waiting for a moment when it wouldn't be interrupted. There had been no argument that day, no bad news, no event I could point to and say, "This is why." That made what came next unavoidable. The clarity didn't rush in. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back inch by inch. I felt it first as discomfort, then as recognition. I wasn't sad in the way sadness usually announces itself. There were no tears yet, no shaking breath, just a still awareness pressing against my chest. I realized I had been carrying something heavy for a long time without acknowledging its weight. Loss. Not the kind you grieve publicly, not the kind people understand easily. The loss of a future I once believed in. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees, my hands clasped loosely together. My breathing stayed steady, but my thoughts slowed, becoming unusually clear. For the first time, I stopped explaining things to myself. I didn't soften the truth. I didn't reframe it as growth or maturity. I didn't hide it behind gratitude. I let it stand as it was. My dream didn't fade on its own. I watched it disappear. The sentence landed with a quiet force. I hadn't been distracted.
I hadn't been unlucky. I hadn't been prevented. I had witnessed the fading and chosen not to intervene. That realization hurt, not sharply, but deeply. It felt like touching something bruised long after the injury occurred. I thought back to the moments when the dream had tried to speak, when it had surfaced gently, without demand. The times I had acknowledged it briefly before pushing it aside. Later, not now. Be realistic. Each time I had been present for the decision. I had been there when I turned away. That night, I stopped pretending otherwise. The room felt quiet in a different way now, less empty, more attentive, as if something inside me had finally leaned forward to listen. I felt tears gather, not from overwhelm, but from relief. Relief at no longer having to pretend that nothing was lost. The tears didn't fall immediately. They stayed suspended, held back by a kind of respect for the truth that had just been spoken. I wasn't angry at myself. Anger would have been easier. Anger creates distance, it assigns blame, it simplifies. This felt more complicated. I felt grief for the time spent negotiating with fear, for the version of myself that had learned to be careful too well, for the belief I had let erode without protest. I felt responsibility, not in a punishing way, but in a grounding one. Responsibility that acknowledged my role without condemning me for it. I had believed that if my dream ever disappeared, it would happen beyond my control. I was wrong. It had faded within reach, and I had watched. The breakdown stayed quiet. No sobbing, no collapse to the floor, no dramatic release. Just tears moving slowly, steadily, as I allowed myself to mourn something that had never officially ended. I cried for the years I had treated as preparation rather than participation, for the moments I had postponed without realizing they were the moment. The grief wasn't about what I didn't become, it was about what I stopped allowing myself to imagine. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and sat there, letting the emotion move through me without rushing it. I didn't look for comfort. I didn't search for meaning yet. This wasn't the moment for lessons. It was the moment for honesty. I understood then why the dream had gone quiet, not out of resentment, not out of weakness, out of respect. It had learned not to interrupt. That realization broke something open inside me, not in a destructive way, in a clarifying one. I had thought that ignoring the dream protected me from disappointment. In reality, it protected me from hope. And hope, I realized, had never been the enemy. Avoidance was. The night deepened outside, the hours passing unnoticed. I remained seated, grounded in the weight of what I had finally admitted. There was no urge to fix anything, no sudden determination to act. That would have felt dishonest. This wasn't about resolution. It was about reckoning. I allowed myself to feel the full shape of the loss, not exaggerated, not minimized, just true. And in that truth, something shifted. The sadness didn't feel endless. It felt complete, like something that had needed to be acknowledged before it could soften. When I finally stood up, my body felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because I was no longer carrying it silently. I turned off the light and lay down staring into the dark. My thoughts were quiet now, not empty, settled. The dream hadn't disappeared in the night. It had been fading for years, and tonight was the first time I stopped pretending I hadn't seen it happen. That admission didn't save the dream, but it changed my relationship to it, and that, I sensed, would matter more than I yet understood.
Chapter 6. The question dreams leave behind.
The morning after the night I admitted the truth felt unusually calm. Not lighter, not hopeful, clear. I moved through the early hours without distraction, noticing how quiet my thoughts were. The sadness from the night before hadn't disappeared, but it no longer pressed against me. It sat where it belonged, acknowledged, no longer hidden. I stood by the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands and watched the city wake up. People moved with purpose, with routine, with urgency. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic. That was when the question surfaced. Not suddenly, not forcefully. It arrived as if it had been waiting its turn. If I never try again, will I be at peace or just quiet? The question didn't accuse me. It didn't demand courage or promise redemption. It simply waited. I turned away from the window and sat down, letting the words settle fully. I didn't rush to answer. I had learned the cost of rushing past difficult questions. Peace and quiet had always sounded similar to me. I realized now they weren't. Quiet is the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of alignment. I had chosen quiet for a long time. It had served me well in some ways. It had protected me from disappointment, from visible failure, from the vulnerability of wanting something deeply. But quiet had also muted parts of me that needed expression. I thought about my past self, not with frustration, but with understanding. I saw someone doing their best with the tools they had, someone who chose safety because safety was available. There was no anger toward that version of me, only clarity. I hadn't been betrayed by circumstances. I had participated in the fading. That recognition could have turned into self-blame. It didn't. Blame simplifies. Responsibility clarifies. Responsibility meant acknowledging that I had chosen quiet repeatedly, not because I was weak, but because it felt manageable. It also meant acknowledging that continuing to choose quiet was still a choice. The question lingered. Peace or just quiet? I understood then that peace wouldn't come from fixing the past or forcing myself into action prematurely. It would come from honesty, from no longer pretending that silence was enough. I didn't need to punish myself for waiting. I needed to decide whether I would continue. That distinction mattered. Regret had kept me facing backward, analyzing what I should have done differently. Responsibility turned my attention forward, not urgently, but deliberately. I thought about the future not as a promise or a threat, but as a continuation of the present. If I kept choosing quiet, the days would remain smooth and muted, stable, predictable, and something essential would remain unexpressed. That realization didn't overwhelm me, it grounded me. I understood that dreams don't leave behind instructions when they fade. They leave behind questions. Questions that don't push, questions that wait. The question I faced wasn't whether I could reclaim the dream immediately. It wasn't whether I was brave enough or talented enough or ready enough. It was whether I was willing to remain silent. That was the choice. Silence or participation. Quiet or peace. I sat with that truth longer than was comfortable. I didn't try to soften it. I didn't turn it into a lesson or a plan. I let it exist as information. And information, when received honestly, changes what is possible. I noticed how my body responded to the idea of remaining quiet. There was no relief in it, no sense of resolution, just a continuation of what I already knew too well. Then I noticed how my body responded to the idea of trying again, not succeeding, not achieving, just trying.
Fear surfaced immediately. So did something else. Energy. Not excitement, not confidence, engagement. That was the difference. Peace didn't promise comfort. It promised involvement. I realized then that the dream hadn't asked me to guarantee an outcome. It had asked me to participate again, to allow wanting to exist without immediately managing it into silence. Responsibility replaced regret in that moment, not dramatically, but decisively. I didn't feel pressure to act. I felt permission to stop hiding. The question remained unanswered in the practical sense. I didn't know what trying again would look like. I didn't know how much effort it would require or how long it would take. But I knew something else. If I never tried again, I wouldn't find peace. I would find quiet. And quiet, I understood now, was no longer enough. That understanding didn't demand courage. It asked for honesty. I finished my coffee, now completely cold, and stood up. The day continued as it always had. Tasks waited, responsibilities remained. Nothing changed on the outside. Inside, the direction had shifted. I wasn't driven by sorrow anymore. I was guided by agency. Agency without blame, choice without urgency, truth without drama. The dream hadn't returned, but it had left behind something just as important, a question I could no longer ignore. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to quiet it.
Chapter 7. Letting the dream speak again. I didn't wake up wanting everything back. That would have been too simple. What returned first wasn't ambition or confidence, but a small, unfamiliar sensation I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. It appeared quietly, without urgency, without demand, a passing thought, a moment of interest that didn't immediately collapse under analysis. I noticed it one afternoon while walking past a bookstore I had ignored for years. I slowed down, not intentionally, not dramatically. My body responded before my mind did. I stopped. The gesture felt strange, almost inappropriate, as if I were breaking an unspoken rule I had lived by for a long time. Don't linger where desire might wake up. I stood there for a moment, aware of my hesitation. Nothing bad would happen if I went inside. Nothing would change. And yet, my heart beat a little faster. That was new. I didn't feel confident. I didn't feel ready. I felt exposed. Still, I opened the door. The smell of paper and quiet filled the space. The familiarity startled me. It reached somewhere deep, stirring something that had been dormant long enough to feel foreign. I didn't rush. I didn't look for anything specific. I let myself wander without purpose, aware of every impulse to retreat. Fear was present immediately. It whispered that this was unnecessary, that revisiting old interests would only reopen questions I wasn't prepared to answer, that wanting again was risky. I listened. Then I stayed. That was the action. Small, unimpressive, honest. I didn't buy anything. I didn't make plans. I didn't commit to a future version of myself. I just allowed the feeling to exist. That night, I noticed the dream hadn't spoken loudly. It hadn't made promises. It had simply cleared its throat. I realized how much energy I had spent silencing it, how quickly I used to redirect my thoughts the moment desire surfaced. Now, I didn't. The next reconnection was even smaller. I wrote a sentence, just one. Not for anyone else, not for publication or validation. I wrote it because I felt the impulse to do so and didn't immediately talk myself out of it. The sentence wasn't good. That didn't matter. What mattered was that I wrote it without apology. Fear hovered the entire time. It pointed out how long it had been, how rusty I was, how insignificant the action seemed. I didn't argue. I wrote anyway. That became the pattern. Small actions taken without confidence. I let myself feel interest without turning it into expectation. I allowed longing to surface without demanding it justify itself. The dream didn't ask for more than that. I noticed how meaning began to return not as excitement, but as texture. Days felt slightly more distinct, moments carried more weight. Not because anything remarkable was happening, because I was paying attention again. Fear never left. It walked beside me, commenting quietly on everything I did. It reminded me of the risks, the time lost, the possibility of disappointment. I didn't try to eliminate it. I acknowledged it and continued. That was the difference. I had spent years waiting for fear to disappear before acting. Now I understood that fear was part of wanting, and wanting was part of being alive. It felt dangerous to want again, but emptier not to. That truth guided me more than any plan could have. I noticed how much gentler I became with myself once I stopped demanding certainty. I didn't expect progress. I didn't measure outcomes. I focused on presence. I showed up where interest led me, even if it led nowhere obvious. Some days the dream felt distant again, quiet. I didn't panic. Silence no longer meant loss. It meant rest. Other days it spoke a little louder. A thought lingered longer than usual. An idea stayed with me past the moment. I listened without clinging. Healing didn't feel like reclaiming something lost. It felt like restoring communication. I had stopped speaking to a part of myself for so long that reestablishing contact required patience. Trust doesn't return instantly. It grows slowly through consistency. I learned how to distinguish between discomfort that signals growth and discomfort that signals avoidance. The difference wasn't always clear, but I was willing to learn. That willingness mattered. I didn't announce my changes. I didn't seek encouragement or approval. The empowerment was quiet, internal, almost private. It showed up in how I made decisions. I chose engagement over detachment, curiosity over dismissal, participation over observation. Not always, but more often. That was enough. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not success, alignment. The sense that my actions matched something inside me again. The dream didn't return fully formed. It returned cautiously, asking questions instead of making demands. I answered by showing up, again and again, without certainty, without guarantees, with honesty. The healing didn't erase the past. It didn't redeem the years of silence. It integrated them. Those years had taught me restraint, awareness, the cost of neglect. Now they informed how carefully I listened. I understood that the dream didn't need me to chase it. It needed me to hear it, to respond, to stop pretending that wanting was a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be explored. That understanding settled into me quietly, changing how I related to everything else. Work felt less mechanical, conversations felt more present, time felt like something slipping away and more like something unfolding. Not faster, just more honestly. I wasn't healed in the dramatic sense. I was reconnected, and reconnection didn't require confidence. It required attention. As I went to sleep one night, I realized I hadn't thought about whether I was behind or ahead all day. The comparison had faded into the background, replaced by something simpler: engagement. I was no longer watching my life from a distance. I was participating. That participation didn't promise success. It promised meaning. And meaning, I understood now, was enough to keep the dream speaking. Quietly, patiently, waiting not to be achieved, but to be heard again.
Chapter 8. My dream didn't fade. I stepped away. I used to believe that time was the reason my dream disappeared.
That years passed, circumstances changed, and something essential was lost along the way. It felt comforting to think of it that way. If time was responsible, then the loss wasn't personal, it was inevitable. But that wasn't true. Time didn't destroy my dream. Avoidance did. Understanding that didn't come with guilt, it came with relief, because avoidance can be reversed. I began to see the dream differently, not as something fragile that needed constant protection, but as something patient, something that didn't demand urgency or perfection, something willing to wait as long as it took. The dream hadn't been chasing me, it had been standing still. I was the one who stepped away. That distinction changed everything. I thought about how often I had framed starting again as an impossible task, as if returning to the dream required recreating the conditions of the past: youth, energy, confidence, certainty. It didn't. The dream wasn't asking for a restart, it was asking for a return. Returning meant arriving as I was, not as I wished I had been, with more caution, more awareness, more honesty. Peace didn't come from erasing the distance, it came from acknowledging it. I no longer felt pressure to make up for lost time. That pressure had been another form of avoidance, disguised as urgency, a way to turn returning into another impossible standard. I let that go. I allowed myself to approach the dream slowly, without apology, without trying to prove that the years away had been worthwhile. Those years didn't need justification. They had shaped me. They had taught me restraint, patience, and the cost of silence. They had shown me what happens when desire is ignored for too long. That knowledge mattered. I realized then that dreams don't fade because they are weak. They fade because they are unattended. And unattended doesn't mean abandoned forever. It means waiting. I felt a calm settle in as I accepted this truth. Not the calm of resolution, but the calm of alignment. The sense that something inside me had returned to its rightful place. Not fully restored, but recognized. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to catch up. I needed to stay present. I stopped measuring my progress by outcomes and started measuring it by engagement. Was I listening? Was I responding? Was I allowing myself to care? Those questions guided me better than any plan ever had. I noticed how the pressure to succeed softened once I stopped treating the dream as something that needed to be justified. Wanting didn't have to earn its place in my life. It belonged there. I belonged there. The dream wasn't a destination I had missed. It was a conversation I had paused, and conversations can be resumed. Peace came from that understanding, not the loud peace of accomplishment or closure, but a quiet peace that settled when resistance ended, when I stopped arguing with the past and stopped demanding guarantees from the future. Returning didn't feel dramatic, it felt natural, like stepping back into a room you once left, noticing how familiar it still is, how little explanation it requires. I had changed. The dream hadn't. It simply waited for me to listen again. I realized then that the most painful part of believing my dream had faded was the finality of it, the idea that something essential was gone forever. Letting go of that belief lifted a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. Nothing essential had been lost. Only distance had grown. Distance can be crossed. I didn't promise myself anything grand. I didn't commit to outcomes or timelines. I didn't make declarations about who I would become. I made a quieter promise: to remain in conversation, to stop stepping away when things felt uncertain, to allow desire to exist without immediately managing it. That promise felt sustainable. It felt honest. I understood then that returning didn't mean reclaiming an old identity. It meant integrating who I was now with what I had always wanted. That integration felt like peace. Not because everything made sense, but because nothing was being ignored anymore. The dream didn't need urgency, it needed presence. As I moved forward, I carried that understanding with me, not as a rule, but as a reminder that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means patience. I had watched my dreams fade away, but they were never gone, only waiting for me to look back.